is finally time for me to get the ball rolling on wrapping up 2024, starting with the tea, which is of course my worst books of the year. So this year I have 8 books to talk about. Honestly, I try and keep a running list of books that I'm going to include in these lists throughout the year, like as the year goes, to make this time of year a little bit easier for me. And up until I actually wanted to make the list for this video, I only had 3 contenders. Now I did actually manage to bump this list up to 10, and then I thought, you know what, 2 of these I'm not really that pressed about. So we have 8 books to talk about today in total. Now only 2 of them are ones that I feel truly bitter about. Like, one of them is one that I genuinely did not enjoy and do not think is a great book, and one of them is the one that I'm the most pressed about. So I'm gonna save those 2 till last, but aside from that, the rest are going to be in no particular order. They are books that I felt stood out for me in a negative way throughout the year. I have read a lot of average books in 2024, books that I haven't particularly enjoyed. However, I do acknowledge that for the majority of those books, I could be the problem. Like, it's just me and this book does not fit for me. Or maybe the book wasn't necessarily bad, I just felt like it didn't stand out very much in terms of all of the books that I've read in the past. So I don't really think it's worth mentioning in a worst books of the year video, just to kind of say it was a little bit mediocre. But we don't want to be hanging around here longer than necessary, dwelling in the negative. So kicking off with the first book that stood out to me a little bit in a negative light, we have actually one of the only ones that I physically own. I am starting off with this one because I feel like it is a sign of the times more than like this is a terrible book, and that is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. Now I did give this one 2 stars. I had no 1-star reads this year, which I mean is always good, but I have actually read a book from Murakami before and given it 5 stars and really enjoyed it. So this one was a little bit of a standout for me. I know when we talk about literary authors, some people get a little bit pressed, but okay, hear me out, okay? I'm not saying this book is trash. I'm just going to talk about the reasons why it didn't work for me. Norwegian Wood is the Murakami novel that you always hear the most about. It is, I kind of want to say, I don't think it's a coming of age story. It's more to me a reflective novel. It's about a man who is revisiting a time in his youth when he was at college. He's telling the story of that time period in his life, but essentially the structure of this plot is formed by 3 women in particular that he knew during this time in his life. Now his backstory is that when he was a child, content warnings for suicide, his best friend killed himself and his best friend's girlfriend, who were the 2 people closest to this boy, have always struggled with his loss and the fact that they lost like one of the most important people in their lives. So this girl does form one of the main female characters. There's also a girl that he meets at college and also a girl who is friends with the girlfriend of his childhood friend. The story in itself, I guess, was fine. It was a little bit meandering, and as with a lot of literary fiction, it didn't necessarily have a plot as much as it was trying to make a point or various points or discuss themes. Typically that is why I stray away from literary fiction and I don't read a whole bunch of it, because I do predominantly read for entertainment purposes and I like books that have a plot. Like, I like following a narrative, whereas when you are reading literary fiction, the narrative is a little bit more difficult to unearth from the messages and the themes and the topics being discussed. This one, I don't want to say it didn't have a point, but I don't think that it really had a plot. And the majority of the scenes in this book were uncomfortable sexual encounters that either the main character was having or that people were telling him about. And Haruki Murakami is actually known for writing very uncomfortable sexual scenes. So it's not that that was necessarily out of the ordinary and different from what I'd read from Murakami before. It's more that it formed the majority of this book. Like, I would say 80% of the content in this book is sexual in nature, and the majority of it is very uncomfortable to read. For that reason, I just didn't really enjoy it all that much. Now, the reason why I say that this is more of a sign of the times than it being a terrible book is that this was published in the 80s and it does talk about mental health in detail. Like, mental health is the main theme and topics underpinning this novel. And not only was this published in the 80s, but it does reflect on a period that is 20 years in the past. So it's actually set in the 60s, which is obviously a time that across the world, like the majority of cultures, including including our culture in the UK, Western culture, the US, we were not talking about mental health. So I feel like at the time that this was published, it opened a lot of discussions. It was covering a topic that nobody really talked about, especially like in Japan. And I feel like that plays a big part into why this is such an iconic novel. So I'm not saying that this does not necessarily deserve the acclaim that it has received. I just think that this is a novel that is best discussed in a literary setting, like if you are studying it at university or you're wanting to dissect the themes and the topics and maybe the place that this has in the time period that it was published. But I think in terms of reading purely for entertainment value, this one was just not a good time for me. It was overly sexual. It made me feel very uncomfortable and I didn't enjoy my time reading it. The most recent book on this list that I've read is Meddling Kids by Edgar Kent's Hero, and I do think that this one is a case of not being the right book for me and also missing the mark on multiple fronts, because this one is a homage to Scooby-Doo, which is what drew me to it. However, when I think about that and think about the type of story that Scooby-Doo is, while I love the TV show, especially when I was a kid, it's not the kind of story that I like to read. It's an adventure story, it is heavily action-based, it is a mystery. All of those things I do not love and I do not reach for, so it's no wonder that I didn't really love this one. But this one is following a group of now adults who, when they were teenagers, they used to all go on summer vacation in the same place and they had a detective club. So like 15 to 20 years before the start of the story, they unmasked the Sleepy Lake monster. However, this case has haunted them into their adulthood and none of them are doing very well as adults. So one of them gets the band back together to go back to the place where they hung out when they were teenagers to get to the bottom of this case, because now they don't think that the Sleepy Lake monster was actually responsible. They think that something actually supernatural was going on there. So this is a horror. It is a little bit of a satirical one and it is a little bit slapstick in the humor, and that is what I didn't like about it from the off. Like, I don't love silly humor. I like sarcasm, I like wit. Body humor or like physical humor, not really for me most of the time. So I didn't get on with it because of that. And like I said, it had all of these plot elements that just aren't what I typically like to read. But then I also thought that the representation was really odd in here. So our main character that gets this group back together is a woman who presents slightly masculine and she self-identifies as a tomboy. But at multiple points throughout this book, she's kind of asked why she isn't a boy. Like, everybody assumed that she would have transitioned at this point. Bearing in mind that this was the 90s, so it wasn't overly common. Like, that isn't something that people were openly talking about constantly and doing. Like, transitioning wasn't something that was available to a lot of people. And at multiple points, whether this is friends or foes, people are asking her, like, why haven't you transitioned? And the main character herself has no desire to transition. She is just a woman who is interested in masculine things and she thinks that is perfectly okay, as it is. And then on top of that, there is actually more trans rep in here, which is used as a plot twist, which I don't love in general, but it is also incredibly poorly done. There's also a lot of insensitivity towards people with mental illness in this book, because one of our main characters has checked himself into an asylum because he's experiencing hallucinations. And I just felt like a lot of it was in poor taste, to the point where I couldn't really enjoy the book for what it was anyway, because it was making me feel uncomfortable in some instances. One of the earliest books that I read in the year, which is undoubtedly one of the worst books that I read in the year, is one that I actually can't tell you that much about, and even directly after I read it, I couldn't give a very good synopsis for this, but it is The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon. So this one is essentially like Reylo fanfic meets the Grishaverse, and it is following a woman who lives in a country that is being oppressed by the Empire, and the Empire are essentially slowly taking over the world, and our main character has this light power that is from a different country that has been at war with the Empire in the past. So we start off the novel where their country is taking like a final stand against the Empire and they ultimately lose and all of the survivors have to flee. So that forms like the very beginning of the novel, and I don't think that it is a very good starting point for this story at all, because ultimately I just found it to be very confusing, because it then shifts to this other country where our main character ends up in some kind of treaty, like marriage pact with with the like son of the leader of the empire, the general of the empire, which is our Kylo Ren figure. And they are obviously on two opposing sides of this war. He's a bad guy doing bad things, she's trying to do good things, and they are forced into a marriage together. Now, I had many criticisms of this book. I thought that the writing was so overly flowery that it actually wasn't really saying anything. The point of the sentences were getting lost in the overly descriptive language. I didn't appreciate the plot in general. I felt like it didn't do anything original, and originality can be overrated. Like, you can have a story that is very similar to a story you've read 1,000 times before, and as long as it is well executed, that is perfectly fine. But I felt like there was nothing special about this iteration of this story in particular, and there was absolutely no character development. I feel like this book very much is dependent on you already knowing who Rey and Kylo Ren are, and in that regard, the main male character, who I'm pretty sure was called Alaric, had as little good motivations for his action as Kylo Ren does. Now, I have talked in length about how I feel about Kylo Ren as a character and as a believable villain, in which I don't believe that his reasons for doing anything that he does are well founded, and Alaric in this book was exactly the same. When it comes down to a romance, which is ultimately what this is, it's a fantasy romance, I need to believe in the villain if we're going to have like an enemies to lovers story. Like, the best villains for me are ones who have a reason for doing what they're doing that is not necessarily noble but makes sense. Like, their vision for the future is one that makes sense to them, and their motivations, their way of achieving that, is what is questionable and doesn't make any sense. If you have weak motivations, which in this book is essentially just that the main character is being told what to do and he doesn't have enough of a backbone to stand up against the people telling him what to do, then I'm not interested. I'm not rooting for you. I don't understand your struggle. I don't empathize with it, and that is essentially what we had here. So this is actually probably one of the worst books that I read this year, because I don't think there's a single thing that I actually enjoyed about it, and I am so glad that I actually have already read that book and cleared it from my TBR. And I know there's going to be equally disappointing books on my TBR that I have still yet to discover, but I'm glad that this is not one of them. We actually have quite a few contemporary romances on my worst books of the year. I'm not sure how many we have in our best. I think we've got at least one. But one of the most mediocre of the worst is Lunar Love. I think the author for this one was Lauren Kung Jessen, and this was following a woman who was taking over her family's dating agency, which was based on the Chinese zodiac. The love interest in here is a business rival, because we are going, or we're already in the modern age, we're already in the digital age, where the majority of people are dating online. However, this is a traditional dating agency, and obviously they are finding that they are struggling against the competition, like they're not getting enough new singles in to make this a viable business. And these are all things that our main character is thinking about, as she is the person who is poised to take over the helm of this company. And our love interest is a guy who is in big tech, and he is designing a dating app which is based on the Chinese zodiac. So our main character is outraged and believes that this guy has stolen her idea, is stealing her family's business. And so she, I can't remember if it's like fake dating exactly, but she does start to get close to him to essentially mine him for information about his business that she can use to save her family company. I didn't love the writing in this book. I thought that a lot of the dialogue fell very flat. So I feel like through the majority of reading this, I was very aware that I was reading a book. It never kind of absorbed me or swept me away. But that is not why this made the worst books of the year list. It made the worst books of the year list because I felt like the main character was just being a terrible person, and the love interest was not retaliating in any way, which just made it kind of sad, because essentially she is using this man who is just being a kind, genuine, stand-up human throughout the entirety of it, to the point where he was kind of being a doormat, because for every kindness she repaid him by walking all over him and trying to steal his business. And I feel like it was never kind of addressed, like he never really expressed how shitty she was behaving, and that was kind of what really sealed the deal for me, because I don't mind like a rivalry kind of situation or this kind of plot where our two characters are equally as feisty, because it kind of cancels out the wrongness of the actions almost, because they're doing it to each other. But when it's so one-sided, honestly, like it's just mean. While we are on the topic of contemporary romances, let's talk about Things We Never Got Over by Lucy Score, which is such a hyped contemporary romance. I definitely enjoyed this less than Lunar Love because this book was just endless. It was far too long. And in this one, we are following a woman who is running away from her wedding. She gets a call from her evil twin sister asking her for money. She's like the good sister. Her twin is off the rails. She moved out when she was really young. She can never hold down a job. She has a string of like horrible boyfriends. And our main character runs away from her wedding with this pouch full of cash to give to her sister, who has rang her and said like, SOS, I need money right now. So she drives to this small town in the middle of nowhere and she goes into the diner looking for her sister. This is the place that they've arranged to meet. And when she gets there, her sister is nowhere to be found. And when she goes back outside to get back in her car, lo and behold, her sister has stolen her car, which had her phone in, and I think the money as well, and left without a trace. And she's been fooled by this evil sister again. Everyone in this town hates this sister because she is notorious for causing trouble. So as soon as our main character turns up, she's kind of facing some aggression from some of the townspeople, including our love interest, who is the town bad boy, Knox Morgan. They very quickly iron out this misunderstanding, but in the process of this, our main character finds out that her twin sister also has a child that their family knew nothing about, that she has now abandoned and is in the care of our main character, who has run away from her wedding and run away from her life, so she has no desire to go back anytime soon. So she hangs around in this town and kind of grows closer to this bad boy figure. Like I said, this book was way too long. I can't remember if it's over 500 pages, but if not, it's very close to that 500 page mark, which for me is just a little bit much for a contemporary romance. It also just has a lot going on. Like for the first half of this book, it is like a straight up small town contemporary romance. Not a lot is happening. Everybody who lives there knows each other. She's kind of getting grounded in this community. And then out of nowhere, we have like an illegal gambling ring. There's like crime lords running around. Somebody gets shot. It gave me whiplash, honestly. And then on top of that, while that does form a part of the plot, this book then doesn't pivot into like a crime or like a mafia romance in any way. It still stays as a small town romance, but just with this really crazy crime story that feels super out of place, especially because the setting of this town could be a cartoon town. Like it could be a town from a children's TV show, because it's the kind of place where like somebody who like owns or runs the bar or works in the bar is called like Five Fiasco, and all of the characters have like these really cheesy cartoony names, and I just couldn't get behind it. I didn't love the romance in general as well, because I thought the love interest was a little bit overbearing, kind of similar to the It Happened One Summer Tessa Bailey love interest, which is another romance that I didn't really particularly love. So yeah, this one was not a hit for me. Weirdly though, I felt like the more I read, the more it kind of grew on me, and I was potentially tempted to continue with this series, but I am happy to say that now that I have some distance from it, I will not be doing that. One of the most disappointing sequels, there was a few disappointing final books and series I read this year actually, one of which is near the top of this list, maybe at the top of this list, but one in particular was Fire Study by Maria V. Snyder, which you guys did warn me about. I have to give you credit for that, but I did not listen, and I'm very sad as well because I loved the first book in this series, Poison Study, which is one of those like classic YA. I don't think it is YA. It's a little bit more than YA, but it is also, I think, published a little bit, just a smidge before the time period when YA is kind of what it is now. It doesn't have the level of complexity of like adult fantasy of that time, but to me it was a little bit more adult than like your typical YA novel as we are familiar with them now. So in this one, we are following a woman called Yelena who is about to be executed for killing the son of a general. Just before her execution date, however, the commander's poison taster dies, so the assassin and spy master for the commander gets her out of the dungeons and offers her this role where she essentially has to learn about poisons and poison test all of the commander's food. So she agrees to this, obviously, because it saves her life. However, the general whose son was murdered now believes that he has been robbed of justice for the death of his son, and so Yelena has to constantly look over her shoulder while she is performing her job because this general has it out for her and is trying to kill her. So I loved the first book. It had this isolated setting pretty much of the commander's keep. We kind of established the world and what kind of political state we were living in now, which is like shortly after the previous government was overthrown. It did a very good job of grounding us in the world and getting us quite attached to our main characters in a way where the pacing was quite slow but also consistently engrossing. Now the second book I did enjoy, but I didn't love as much as the first book, and the third book, Fire Study, study was just a shambles. Like, the second book I felt was very slow at the beginning and very rushed at the end, which didn't make sense to me. I felt like the plot threads were going into the third book to be wrapped up there, which they were. However, it was just wall-to-wall action in book 3, consistent fight and battle scenes, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and the only thing that was linking them together was the main character being knocked unconscious. Like, the only transition between battle and not battle was this girl waking up from her slumber, and it was so tedious and such a mess, honestly. Like, I don't understand how we got to where we were. I don't know whether the story got away from the author. I don't know whether it was intended to be a standalone and it did so well that the publisher requested more, but she didn't have as much of a concrete idea of what more was going to be. But it was just nothing like the first book and not a good time. So I actually intended to continue on with this series because I think it's 9 books in total, and it has like a trilogy after this one that follows a different character, and then it cycles back to those 2 main characters from the first trilogy. I just didn't have it in me, and still at this point I have no desire to continue with this one ever again. And now we come to the final 2, and I don't know which one to talk about first. I guess we'll save the one that I'm the most bitter about for last, even though I don't especially intend to get ranty, because I'm honestly just so mad about it that I don't want to talk about it ever again. But before that, one that I think might genuinely be the worst book that I've read this year, or one that I just very much enjoyed the least, was All the Feels by Olivia Dade, which is, it's the second book in a series, but like a series of romance standalones, so you can read them out of order, it doesn't really matter. And this one is following a woman who is a mental health professional, and she wants a little bit of a break from her job, so she's intending on traveling, and she stops by the place where her cousin works. He is, I can't remember if he's like a writer or a producer for television, and when she arrives, the star of his show has got into a bar fight, so he essentially assigns her to babysit this guy to keep his reputation under control until the release of the final season of this TV show is aired, so that he can't damage the reputation of himself or the show. So she's not assigned in the role of a mental health professional, she's just assigned in the fact that like she's this guy's cousin to babysit an actor. There's so many reasons why I didn't love this. Okay, I don't read a ton of fanfic in general. It's not my thing. It's not something that I go out of my way to read. And I didn't know going into this that this was Game of Thrones fanfic. Specifically, Nikolai Coster-Waldau fanfic, who plays Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones. I thought that that was very obvious in the context of conversations that they were having about this fictional TV show that they were working on. As far as I can tell from the synopses of the other 2 books in the series as well, this is a series of fanfic books about Game of Thrones actors and their hypothetical feelings on season 8 of the TV show. So this book in particular, I don't know about the other 2, is set before season 8 of Game of Thrones is aired, which if y'all are a Game of Thrones fan, you will know that that is a shambles. You could tell from the way the actors were skirting around questions and being super vague about stuff that they weren't necessarily happy with how the show ended, and I'm wondering if there's an embargo on that and whether they're actually ever, like many years to come, gonna talk about it, because it just wasn't great. So I didn't know that, and fanfic, I think when we're talking about real people, makes me feel weird. But the actual reason why I didn't like this is because of the way that the male love interest, the Nikolai Coster-Waldau figure, talks about our female main character. What Olivia Dade is trying to do with this book, and I think all of her novels, is empower people who are not conventionally attractive and represent them in romance, which is a genre that typically only represents the most beautiful among us. I understand what she's trying to do, but I really did not like the execution in this, and it made me feel incredibly uncomfortable, not only in the way that the main character was represented, but also in the way that she is regarded by the love interest, who is a romantic lead in this book. So she is described as having like really skinny legs and a really round body, a crooked like beaky nose. So she's painted as not being conventionally attractive, which is fine. However, the way that he regards her and talks about her, I found unacceptable. A specific instance that I keep falling back on, that when I think about it, I still cannot believe that it was in there is that there is this scene where he compares her to a bird. And as I said, her nose is described as being crooked and beaky. So it is something that she is particularly self-conscious about in general. And when he says this to her, when he compares her to a bird, she thinks that this is a dig at her nose specifically. And he sees that he's upset her and he's like, oh no, like I can't believe that I've done this. Like I need to make it better. So he tells her like, no, I didn't mean your nose. Like I wasn't insulting your nose. I mean your entire body looks like a bird, but that's okay because I like birds. So it's fine that you look like one. I was shook. If I'm being honest. The love interest as well also has ADHD, and I'm not in a position to tell you guys whether it was accurate representation or not. However, my impression of how ADHD was represented in this book is that it was a cut and paste stereotypical representation of how we believe people with ADHD behave. So essentially hyperactive golden retriever types with no nuance into ADHD at all, which especially in the year of 2024, I feel like we have learned a lot about ADHD and the different way that it manifests, and that it's not just people who can't sit still. But I felt like all of that nuance was just not in this book. It was just like your stereotypical ADHD main character, and I didn't love that about it as well. And then finally, this is actually my worst book of the year. Not because it was the worst book that I read, although I actually could make a strong argument that it is, but because of how disappointed I was and how angry I still am about it. And it is, of course, House of Flame and Shadow by Sarah J. Maas. Now, if y'all have been here for a while, you will know that a Sarah J. Maas book in my worst books video of the year, unheard of, never happened. If you were here 4 years ago and you were just tuning in now, you would wonder if you'd clicked on the wrong channel, because I was the biggest SJM fangirl up until I read this book. Now, I will say that I have not loved the last three, including this one, Sarah J. Maas book, so I was a little bit like dubious, but as somebody who has supported this woman for a long ass time, like I've been reading these books for 9 years, I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, and not after this. This book, in my opinion, is genuinely bad. So it's not even that I'm disappointed because I wish something different had happened. I'm not throwing all of my toys out of the pram because it didn't end the way that I wanted to. I genuinely think that this is a terrible book. And it's not the worst book I've ever read. There are definitely fantasy books that are worse than this. But I think in comparison to other Sarah J. Maas books, and I have read them all, and I have given all of them nearly, almost 5 stars, this is just not good. So if y'all are unfamiliar with this series in general, it's following a young half-fae woman called Bryce Quinlan, who is tasked with investigating a series of murders by the Archangel of the city. So she is not an investigator, she's an antiquities dealer. However, the Archangel believes that she has a personal tie to the murderer or the murders in general. And so he asks her specifically to investigate, but because it's dangerous and she's not equipped for this, he assigns her a bodyguard in the form of the fallen angel Hunt Athalar. Now, despite how much I despise this book, the first book in the series is still my favorite book of all time, and that makes this infinitely more disappointing, because when I tell you the stakes in book 1 were higher than they were in book 3, I am not even joking. There was no points of high tension in the end of this book. I was not worried about the lives of anyone. They have been fighting against this foe for 3 books, and the resolution was so easy. They didn't even break into a sweat. It was like, click your fingers, it's all over, let us all go back to our regular lives. There was a point in here where it turned sci-fi in a completely nonsensical, almost, oh my god, I saw a reflection and thought that I was being haunted. That was scary. So there's this like whole sci-fi wibbly wobbly timey-wimey black hole section of this book that makes absolutely no sense. All of the characters were acting out of character, including characters that, shall we say, were only introduced into this series in this book, were acting strangely. The main characters of this book, who spent so much time growing and healing from their trauma, growing together in that regard as well, and really valuing each other, kind of just turned their back on each other and were behaving horrendously. The only character worth mentioning in this book is Rune. He saved this book for me. It would have been a 1 star without him. I gave it a 3 star at the time, but I said that I was being generous. It is definitely a 2 at best. There are characters in here that were in book 1, but throughout book 2, they were introduced as main character perspectives. And one of the main criticisms of book 2, I understand this, but it's not one of my main gripes of book 2, but a lot of people don't like that these two characters got so much page time in book 2. However, I was kind of trusting the process, and I was like, okay, while they're not super interested in book 2, I know that the reason why they're getting so much page time is because they're going to be super relevant in book 3. They're not. They're not relevant at all. Their storylines that take up so much page space in book 2 do not resolve in book 3. They just kind of fizzle into the background of book 3 to assumedly be picked up at a later date. We got answers and plot reveals for mysteries that have been unanswered since the beginning of the first book of this series, and they were so underwhelming that they undermined the fact that they have been such an integral mystery of this entire series. The whole thing was just bad, in my opinion. And like I said, this is coming from somebody who has given the majority of Sarah J Maas books 5 stars, and I've read every single one. I've read everything. If this book did not have her name on it, I would not think that she had written it. I would think that somebody else had, because it is so out of place amongst all of her other books. And I will never not be mad about it. I will never not be mad about it, because the first book in this series, and I've reread it multiple times, is still my favorite book of all time. And this one is unrecognizable. It doesn't even belong in the same series. And I'm just really confused as to what happened and how this went so poorly, especially because of the build up to this book, not only in terms of like promotion, but also in terms of the narrative build up to this book. For it to flop so hard is honestly a travesty. And I know a lot of people going into 2025 are like so excited for Sarah J Maas to drop the announcement, like the release date for book 6 in ACOTAR. I actually don't want that book to ever be published, because I don't want to be disappointed by another Sarah J Maas book. Like, I'm gonna read it, but at this point it's not something that I'm excited about. It's something I'm dreading, because I feel like I'm much more likely to be incredibly disappointed and upset than I am to enjoy the book. And that is so sad, because Sarah J Maas was my favorite author, and no, she is no longer. So those were the worst books that I read in 2024. I hope that the tea wasn't too hot. Generally speaking though, like, a bad book is a bad book. We don't have to sit in that negativity. Like all bad things that happen to us in life, we don't have to sit in that negativity. Sitting in that negativity is a choice. And generally speaking, unless I am emotionally distraught like I was when I read this massive disappointment, I don't really spend too much time dwelling on the bad books that I read. I kind of just want to forget about them and move on, which is the same for all of the bad things that happen in my life, which is probably why I should be in therapy. However, I'm not. Instead, I'm here complaining about books to you guys on the internet. But anyway, for a little bit of spice, a little bit of tea, let me know down in the comments what your least favorite book of 2024 was. And if you guys would like to let me know that you were here, but you don't feel like you have anything to say, please leave me, I don't want to see it, but please leave me a flame emoji for House of Flame and Shadow. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you will find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, and my Patreon if you would like to join me on any of those. So that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.